This interactive video will focus on ethical theory, and as reported by Plato in the Republic, Socrates says, "We are discussing no small matter, but how we ought to live." And that's a nice guiding thought as we embark here. So, first, let's just throw out some preliminary questions and just kind of let them float around a bit. So, first, in order to know how to live, it is not only useful, I'd say it's necessary to try to define the good life. What do you think constitutes the good life? And many answers come back when you pose that question, right? Is it pleasure, success, power, wealth? Is it rationality, increasing your rationality and becoming a more rational, reasonable person? Is it the deepening and broadening of your consciousness? Does that constitute the good life? And many of us will define the good life differently at different points in our lives. And there are cross-cultural differences in these definitions. It's just something to think about, because to talk about and theorize about how one ought to live, it's, again, helpful and I think necessary to at least posit what you think is the good life and why you think that. And then there are some other questions to just sort of kick around in your head. Why be moral at all? Right? What's the justification? Morality and notions of good, bad, right, and wrong come from all sorts of sources, and they are entrenched in us from the moment we're born, pretty much. Your parents try to tell you what is right and wrong, good and bad, and punish you and reward you accordingly. Your society and the law tries to stipulate what's good, bad, right, and wrong, and how you ought to behave. But if you start to peel it back a little bit and you look for an argument, what's the justification philosophically? Why be moral other than because your parents say so, or the law says so in some instances, or your religion says so, right? So you can come back with many different answers to this as well. Like, is it to please God? If you are a religious person, that might be the justification. I behave in certain ways because it's pleasant or pleasing to God, or God says so. Is it to promote our own self-interest? Is that why we ultimately have a moral code? There are some ethical theories that claim exactly this. Is it to promote the interest of others? Likewise, there's ethical theories that say that this is the justification. Is it to maximize pleasure and happiness for as many people at as many times and in as many places possible through our actions? There are theories that correspond to that answer. Is it to maintain and promote our rational faculties? Because morality is built into us and is a natural extension of rationality. There are some theories that posit that as the justification. Is it to safeguard our rights and allow for civilized living so we can trust one another to a certain extent? There are theories that posit that as the justification. Is it to promote the flourishing of human life and denounce everything that doesn't? Again, there are theories that posit that as the justification. Or is it to dampen our individual power and creativity, making us easier to control? There are theories that say that as well. Something to just kick around in your head a little bit as we enter this study of ethics. So here's a quick flashback to the areas of ethics. Do it real quickly, right? Like we discussed previously, there are descriptive ethics, meta-ethics, normative or prescriptive ethics, and applied ethics, which is where bioethics is going to be, but we're discussing ethics in general right now. And specifically, we're going to take a quick dip into meta-ethics. So consider this. This is usually a good place to start to get a handle on meta-ethical questions. Consider two different types of statements, like scientific claims. So a statement in philosophy is also known as a proposition, and a statement or a proposition is a sentence with a truth value. It means that it's capable of holding truth or falsity, unlike other sorts of sentences, like, a question is a sentence. A question can't hold truth or falsity. If I asked you, where do you live, and you said true, this would make no sense, right? But a good way to look at it is a statement or a proposition is a declarative sentence. It tries to say that something is or is not the case. And then you can say true or false to it, right? So some examples of scientific statements are simple ones. The earth rotates around the sun, or water is composed of hydrogen and oxygen, or cholera is caused by bacteria. You can say true or false to any of these, and it would make sense to ask, are these true or false? That's really the point here. Now, there are also moral statements, like polygamy is morally wrong, or genocide is morally wrong, or experimenting on prisoners is morally permissible. Now, if you notice, it makes sense to say true or false to any of these, right? If I say to you, is it true that polygamy is morally wrong? You could choose true or false, but it would make sense if you answered either true or false. Same here. Genocide is morally wrong. You could say true or you could say false to that. Nobody's asking for an answer right. I'm not asking for an answer right here, but it would make sense to say true or false to these two sentences, and this one as well. Right? So most of us would consider this left column to contain objective facts. Now, here's the issue. Whether you think the right column contains possible objective facts or merely cultural values / opinions commits you to a meta-ethical position on ethics in general. Remember, meta-ethics examines the nature of moral judgments. So, do you think that these are capable of being kind of universally true or only culturally true? Or some and some? And the answer you choose is going to put you into a certain meta-ethical camp regarding ethics. And here are those two meta-ethical camps. One is relativism, ethical relativism. Ethical relativism has two different subcamps, known as ethical subjectivism and cultural relativism. And we'll take those two in turn briefly. On the other hand, though, there is ethical universalism. And then there's a whole mess of theories that are universalist in character, but they just disagree with one another. They all claim, however, that yes, moral statements can be objectively and universally true, and then the theories answer why and how, but they just disagree with one another. Now, in the relativist camp, they say it is impossible for a moral statement to be universally true or false. It is all relative to either opinion or the culture within which you find that moral statement being uttered and practiced. Right? So these are the two camps. There's a major... this is kind of black and white in terms of their disagreement with one another. So quickly, we'll look at ethical subjectivism. This is in the relativist camp. Ethical subjectivism says, hey, our moral opinions are just that. They're opinions. Morality is based on our feelings and nothing more. There is no objective right or wrong that holds for all cultures, all people, all times, all places. And whenever you utter or say that something's wrong, you're really just stating or expressing your disapproval of it. Nothing more. So in other words, when you say, let's say, genocide is morally wrong, that amounts to nothing more, and that's equivalent to you simply stating, I disapprove of genocide. And can that be true or false? Sure, but only for the individual. That statement, if you're an ethical subjectivist, whether or not the statement can be true or false goes no further than the individual. It can be true for you or it can be false for you, but that's the extent of truth. So, to say X or whatever is morally acceptable, X is right, X is good, X ought to be done, amounts to, I approve of X. And if it's true that you approve of X, then this statement can be true. If you're lying, then the statement is false, and that's the end of it. That's as far as it can go. Now, there are some objections to ethical subjectivism as a theory. First, that it's self-refuting and it's contrary to our moral experience. So, consider the statement. All ethical statements are relative. Well, if everything is as relative as the ethical subjectivists say, then this can't be true either. Or one ought to be an ethical subjectivist. You can't say anything like that. You can barely even be a proponent of your own theory because it becomes self-refuting. You see? Also, it can't account for our fallibility and the fact that sometimes we're wrong in our moral judgments. Sometimes we think that if we go a long time thinking that something is bad or wrong, and we have an experience or we learn something new and see it in a different light, and we change our minds and we no longer think it's wrong. So if ethical subjectivism were true, if it's just a matter of approval or disapproval, then how can you ground, then it's almost like saying it's a matter of opinion whether you like vanilla ice cream or chocolate ice cream. Right? There's just a shift in opinion. But sometimes we come to really stark conclusions like, man, I was really wrong about the way I thought about this before. And ethical subjectivism as a theory can't account for that. Also, it can't account for disagreement in ethics. Some of the most violent, I don't even want to call it disagreements, but fights and wars are over ethics and ethical perspectives and ethical judgments. And if it really were the case, metaethically, that it's all a matter of opinion, then why is it that we get into such charged disagreements over these issues? If it really were the truth, we wouldn't fight to be like, that's your opinion and this is mine, and we'll go our separate ways. It would, once again, to use the ice cream analogy, it'd be like beating each other up because somebody says vanilla's the best and somebody says that chocolate's the best. That seems really ridiculous, correct? Well, if it's the case that ethical subjectivism is true, then, I mean, that's the way we would deal with, hey, abortion is wrong or abortion is okay. We wouldn't fight so hard over it. So those are some standard objections to ethical subjectivism as a theory. Also, ethical subjectivists still behave as if there's an objective right or wrong. They do get this angry. That's another standard objection to this as a theory. And also, it entails an unacceptable moral equivalence. Like Ted Bundy, the serial murderer. His moral views are no better or worse than yours. They're just different. He likes vanilla, you like chocolate, and go your separate ways. But something doesn't feel right about that. Right? So those are some common objections to ethical subjectivism, which is a compartment of relativism. Then there's cultural relativism, which is that other compartment of relativism. And that one says, hey, different societies have different moral codes. We can see that. We know that now. Anthropologists have told us that. We're aware. We read books. We understand this. And from that, we can derive the soft conclusion that, hey, well, then there must be no objective standard that can be used to judge one societal code as better than another. And the moral code of our own society has no special status. It's just one amongst many. So there's no universal truth in ethics. That is, excuse me, there are no moral truths that hold for all people at all times. They're all relative to the culture within which one finds oneself. What might be true for one culture might be false for another, and so be it. But there are some standard objections to cultural relativism as a theory as well. And that is, if cultural relativism is true, we could no longer say that the customs of other societies are morally inferior to our own, which others think of America. Excuse me, let me back that up. There are cultures around the world that American culture, cultural practices around the world that we as Americans find immoral. For example, let's say, I hate to go so gnarly, but female genital mutilation. We look at that and say, this is wrong. This is just flat wrong. Or stoning, honor killings and such. This is wrong. This must be abolished. Well, if cultural relativism is true, there's no real argumentative grounds to take that position, because that's their culture. You have your own, and that's the end of it. So this is another objection to cultural relativism as a theory. Also, the idea of social reform and social reformers would have to be reconsidered, because we couldn't even criticize our own society. Take any reformer or any civil rights leader who has come out against the dominant culture in any place and argued against it and rebelled against it on behalf of, let's say, civil rights. They would essentially be wrong. in that scenario, because there's no right, there's no objective right. Do you see what I mean here? You looking at even your own culture, and if it's all relative, if moral truths, quote unquote, are relative to the culture, then how do you explain a moral reformer going against the dominant culture of the time? What are they appealing to if everything's relative? It seems as if they'd be saying, look, there is something better. There is a better way. There is that could apply to all people. You lose that ground when you adopt absolute cultural relativism as your ethical theory. Can't explain moral progress because it identifies morality with maintaining the status quo. Sometimes whole cultures progress morally. The abolition of slavery is an example that comes to mind readily. Right? But how can you say we're better than we used to be if all ethics are relative, is the idea behind this standard objection. And also, it encourages blind conformity to cultural norms rather than rational analysis of moral issues. And the hunt, in other words, it sort of undermines the hunt for any objective moral truths, which doesn't mean all moral statements have to have an objective basis, but it undermines the hunt for even finding some that may transcend individual opinion or transcend cultures. So those are some standard objections to cultural relativism as a meta-ethical theory. Now, back to this slide. In order to do applied ethics, and bioethics is a part of applied ethics, this is where we need to park it. So if in your own lives and hearts and minds you believe that this is the case, that meta-ethically you think it's all relative either to individuals or to cultures, that's fine. But you can't do applied ethics without adopting a theory, a universalist theory. Because what are you going to do? Let's say, imagine it either deteriorates into pure prescriptive ethics. Excuse me, let me back that up. Your attempt to resolve a controversial issue. Let's say about should you be allowed to sell a kidney, for instance. Say that's the issue at hand. Yes or no? Well, if you're a relativist, how can you argue? What are you going to argue besides, well, it's a matter of personal opinion, or it's cultural, right? It's okay in some cultures, but not others. I mean, all of that's descriptive. You can't say, yes, we ought to, and answer why, or no, we ought not to, and answer why. Because your foundation, the relativistic foundation, is not strong enough to hold up these sorts of arguments. You have to presume one or more ethical theories to drive the argument. And you'll see what I mean by this when we do get into the ethical issues. We got a lot of theory and philosophy to do first. But this is what we're going to go forward and study. Particularly, we're going to look at these theories. And then once we get into applied ethics and our bioethics, we'll see how these theories are used to drive arguments about controversial bioethical issues. So now, what I'm about to say here is a little redundant. I pretty much caught it or captured it all in the last one. So which camp will we be learning about and drawing from? Well, applied ethics, including bioethics, uses universalist normative moral theories in the attempt to sort through complicated and controversial issues. So in other words, Bioethics begins from the meta-ethical position that there are at least some objective moral truths out there that can be reasoned and argued about. And like I just said in the slide previous, you need a strong foundation to build a strong house. You need a stopping place to build your argument, which doesn't mean that your argument is true. There's no such thing as a true argument. An argument is a system of reasoning. Right? There can be true statements, there can be true premises, true conclusions, but an argument cannot be true. It can either be well constructed and well founded, or poorly constructed and poorly founded. And relativism as an ethical position does not provide the foundation that's necessary in order to build bioethical arguments. So that's why we're starting here and in this camp. So topics covered: ethics in general, ethical relativism, which includes ethical subjectivism and cultural relativism, standard objections to those theories. We talked about the need to presume a universalist meta-ethical position in order to do bioethics in the first instance, and specifically that bioethics needs normative ethical theories, and normative ethical theories need at least a soft universalist meta-ethical position, which again doesn't mean that in your heart and mind and soul you need to adopt that position, but it's necessary to make these arguments, and that's why the course goes the way that it goes.